Hello and welcome to Conversations from the Adoption and Fostering podcast. In this episode, I speak to adoptive parent James, and he shares his experience of adoption. James was assessed, matched, and had a child moved in entirely during the lockdown, and we discuss this and the challenge of the adoption process during a troublesome period. As always, if you've experienced adoption, fostering, or special guardianship from any perspective and would like to share that on the podcast, please get in touch through the Facebook or Twitter page, or you can email us at andfpodcast@gmail.com.
So today I am joined by James. Hi, James.
Hello.
Hello. So tell us who, what, where, and when. Just feel free to tell us the story.
Okie doke. Well, I'm James, as you say, and me and my wife are adopters now of a little 2-year-old boy. He's just turned 4 weeks ago. I should know that. Let's hope he doesn't listen to that bit. He's just turned 2, and we started our journey originally in, I guess you'd say, sort of the end of 2018, basically. I guess sort of to dig into the meat of the initial thing. So me and my wife cannot have natural children. My wife hit the early menopause, as it now turns out, because we didn't know this at the time, in basically her late 20s, early 30s. But we didn't know that at the time of starting the actual process, to be honest, of adoption. What sort of happened is, we've been sort of, as people do, you've been trying for a family, you'd had no luck, you've been referred to the medical, all these different medical professionals. They tested me, they tested her, and they essentially couldn't find anything wrong. And we ended up going to a fertility clinic where we sort of, I guess, dug into the issues deeper. And coming out of that fertility clinic, the discussion at the time was, because we're both of a fairly portly nature, I think it's safe to say, to be polite about it. This sort of discussion mainly was, look, we think mainly it's your weight. You just need to lose weight, which we're like, okay, fair enough. We'll give it a shot, and we were told at the time, at least what we remember, but I'm sure any medical professional who worked with us would deny this fact now, that we were told, just make an effort to lose as much weight as possible. We'll see you in X amount of months and we'll see where you go from there, basically. So we did, and we dieted and we did all that stuff, and as you do. And we turned up back at the clinic after the designated time period, and we'd lost quite a bit of weight. I suppose my wife more than me, but either way. We walked in and they said, okay, well, you've made a good effort, but we need you to hit this weight. You shouldn't have come back if you hadn't have hit X weight. And we were like, well, you never said that. You said, show an effort and then we'll start some extra steps. And they're like, no, we can't do any extra steps without you doing hitting this target weight. And I guess we're kind of stubborn people, really. And we'd always talked about adoption on and off anyway. Like, ever since I met my wife, we've been together now 11 years this year. So, and ever since we'd met, we'd sort of talked about kids, and she's always been in the childcare profession, so she's always wanted children, and we've often on and off discussed the topic of, when we're older we might adopt, or when we're older we might foster, which I think is a conversation a lot of people have, right? Like, it's not a particularly unusual conversation. And when we got sent away, we were quite dejected by the clinic, so we sort of looked into a bit more. But I think at that point, we still hadn't quite hit that lip of going, right, let's give it a go. And I can remember, I can't comment on my wife specifically, but I can remember my specific moment when I thought, right, let's give up this sort of fertility thing and go and look into adoption much deeper. And I was sitting at a family barbecue, and my relatives all have young children. So they're all bouncing around the bouncy castle. And I was just sitting on the steps of the house watching these kids bounce the bouncy castle. And I felt quite empty. I don't know if that's a good way of phrasing it. Very sort of, something was missing. I felt like something was missing. So, I mean, I'm sure this will come up later on, but the initial thought process of us going for adoption was, I guess, a wholly selfish one, because we felt very empty, We didn't feel like our family was complete, and adoption was going to be a way to do that. And we sort of left that barbecue, and I was sort of saying to my wife, something's missing. Like, let's read up a bit more into adoption. Like, let's do a bit more research. And you kind of go through Christmas then, and it's in February 2019 is when we went to, I call it the introduction seminar, but I'm sure it's got many different names, which is the council run intro to adoption, where you sit in a room with 50 odd people or whatever it is, and they sit there and they, to be fair, the one we went to, and I don't know if this is common across all of them, but they were quite positive about adoption. There wasn't a lot of negativity in it, which with the benefit of hindsight, I feel like there probably should have been a bit, not more negativity, but a bit more realism in it. Because it was all very like, well, you can adopt a child, and some of these children will come with problems, but don't worry, guys, you'll be amazing at it. And they had an adopter stand up in front of them who was like, well, we adopted, and it was amazing. It's really changed our life. Yes, it threw our life into chaos, and originally the plan was I was not going to work and my husband was going to work, and now we flipped it round because that's the needs of our child. And they read out a couple of case files for the children they had in the care system for that local authority at the time. And they were like, well, this is, and to be honest, we came out of that meeting being like, well, we could do that. That sounds like we could do it. Yeah. Nothing scary there. And we're quite pig-headed, as we'll feature often in the discussion. So we sort of, and a little bit rose-tinted glasses, especially at that time, I'm sure. So we would almost immediately signed up. I think that was February, and we signed up in the March, basically. We went for our first sign-up meeting in March, and that's in 2019. That was basically how we got started, I suppose, in the journey.
Yeah.
I can carry on digging even deeper unless you've got something.
No, do carry on. I was just going to say, though, obviously this all started pre all this COVID malarkey. So,
yes.
But yeah, because we've had, as you'd expect, we've had so many people kind of who've gone through the process during COVID as well, which adds a very unique feature to it. But it's interesting what you were saying about the kind of information even, which is what I think they would call, I don't know. Every agency is different. So
yeah, this was for the local authority near us rather than a private agency. It's worth pointing that out. It was a local authority run meeting, because I may be different.
So when you went to that, I think, and local authorities I think they've all got different names for them, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. That's a bit of a detail. But so what were your views on adoption before you went to that meeting? What you said, obviously you've been through quite a process and quite a journey yourselves. Sorry to use that word journey, but you kind of you probably hadn't come to a conclusion about what you were going to do. But what were your thoughts on adoption before you went to that meeting?
I think when we went to the introduction meeting, we'd more or less decided we weren't going to be going any further with the fertility sort of aspect of things. I think I certainly had. As I say, I can't comment on my wife's standpoint, but I would say she was probably in agreement there. I think, we'd been essentially trying for a child at that point for 9 years. And regardless of the as now diagnosed fertility issues at the time, there didn't seem to be a logical reason why we couldn't, we're portly, but we're not like, sort of like, can't fit through a doorway. Do you know what I mean? Like this, people fatter than us have kids, but if you want me to go sort of layman's terms on it. So I think, there wasn't, to us, there was sort of like, it was just too much frustration of jumping through the sort of hurdles of this sort of medical system. So I think we sort of made a mind up that we were going to do something else. We didn't know exactly what that would be. And adoption, again, it's the rose-tinted glass thing, right? Adoption, I think when we first walked into it, we were absolutely, and it's now I think it's such a foolish thing to say, because having listened to your podcast and other people and even going through the whole process ourselves, it is one of those silly things. But we sort of walked in and we were almost like, we will save the children. We can save them. These kids need to, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure that we can't be the only people who ever walked in with that mindset. And I think we were absolutely in that set. We were like, we want a family. This is a way to get a family. There's kids out there that need a family. We'll do it. And it was almost as simplistic as that at that very early stage. Obviously, it evolved over time. But yeah, I think we definitely decided the fertility route was not going to be the way we went, which will come up a little bit actually in I guess the rest of the story, which is so basically we went to that meeting. In March we started signing up and we did all the paperwork. So we did what is commonly referred to as quote unquote stage 1, which I've never understood why they call them such generic names, because it's stage 1 and stage 2 always seem to me almost exactly the same, just with more detail. But they have their far be it from me to judge that. So we did all the sort of documentation for stage 1 between March and May. And I think, again, with the rose-tinted glasses and the sort of benefit of hindsight now, when we started filling that out, there was a lot of questions. And I can remember having an argument with the social worker at the time where we were filling out all the paperwork. And I have to admit, I was like, I don't see how this is relevant. There was questions on the form where, and I mean, I stand by some of these questions being irrelevant even now, but there was a question on there, for example, where it said, what music did you listen to in your teens and how did that change for you into adulthood? And I was like, well, I don't see how that's relevant. Why are you asking, like, what difference does that have to me in parenting a child? Now, I maintain that question's a bit silly, but then the flip side of that there was other questions where it was like, how did your grandparents raise you? How was your relationship with your grandparents? Now, my grandparents died when I was very young, so I don't really remember them. I was about 12 when my last grandparent died. So I've got very fuzzy memories and, those sort of spot memories you just remember of certain things, like an image of you sitting on a sofa or playing with a certain toy. So I wrote all that on the form and they came back and they said to me, no, that's not enough. We need to know what your relationship was like. And I was like, well, they were just my grandparents. Like, they just raised me. They raised me with my parents. Like, what? And to this day, I remember the social worker said to me, but she's like, yeah, but you have to understand that if your grandfather whips you with a belt, we need to understand how you coped with that so that you can then understand how you are as an adult. And I was like, but he never whipped me with a belt. Why would it? That's why I know that it happens, but it shouldn't happen. But why are you automatically assuming my family are assaulting me on a daily basis as a child? What is this? So we that started this beginning of the frosty relationship with the social worker that I think unfortunately kind of persisted for much of that sort of stage 1, which didn't get any better because she then visited the home in June. So we'd done all the paperwork. We had it sent back once. We did it again. And this was sort of got round to June by this point. And she came to the house here. Now, we live with my mother in a 4-bedroom detached house, which is contextually important because obviously they have to understand that she's here and we're a family here. But that's how we live. And she came to the house, and at the time we were renovating it so we could have enough space for a child to come and live here. So we'd converted the garage into a room downstairs, but it wasn't finished yet. It was still being built. The upstairs bedroom, which is now his room, was full of the stuff from the garage, So we were like, this will be cleared out well before a child comes home. Like, it's all in there, And she's like, all right, okay. She's sort of taking all her notes, and she's writing everything down that we're saying, which you can understand. So, but you're just sort of going with the process. And then she interviewed my mum, and she sat down with my mum. And my father passed away in 2017, quite unexpectedly. So we're 2 years on from that when she's sitting down with my mother. And my mum said to us afterwards, because you talk, don't you? And she said, well, we sat down and she said to us, right, they're living with you. What are you going to do if you get a new man? And my mum was like, I've been married to my husband for 34 years. He died 2 years ago. I don't want another man. What are you talking about? So immediately again, the social worker's kind of getting everybody's backs up. And she was like, well, if you did find a new man and he said, oh, I can't live with your kids, because I'm an only child, your son here and his family, you'd kick them out on the street, wouldn't you? And my mum's like, Are you an idiot? No, of course I wouldn't kick him out in the street. That's my only child. I would never kick him out in the street. If a man just came into my house and told me to do that, he'd be out the door before they would be. Like, it's not like if you took 5 minutes of seeing my family, and people have to take my word for this, whoever's listening to this, but honestly, if you spend an afternoon or even an hour with my family, you'll know, like, we're absolutely tight-knit. Like there's nothing my mum wouldn't do for us and vice versa. We couldn't live in this house if that wasn't the case, because it's, you know, 4-bedroom house is fine, but you're still on each other's business all the time. So you have to be kind of happy to live together, or you just drive each other insane, right? So she took a lot of offense to that, my mother, and obviously we did afterwards because she told us about it. And then essentially all that sort of came to head, and then we're speaking to the social worker sort of towards the end of June, and we're saying, right, well, when's stage 2 going to start? Like, how are we doing with the paperwork? We've given you it back. How are we looking? And she said something very sort of strangely cryptic and fairly non-committal. And we're like, that's odd. Why? You know, she's not being very definitive about anything here. You know, she just kept sort of going, oh yeah, well, we're reviewing it. And we're like, okay, fair enough. Maybe this is just how the process works, because of course we didn't know how the process worked, really. And then at the end of June, we got a meeting with that social worker and her boss, and she said, "Oh, I need to have a meeting with you, with me and my line manager." I don't know whether she was the head of the service or not, to be quite honest. I can't remember now. Might be just department manager. Hang on, it's on here somewhere. She's a team manager. There you go. I've got the letter in front of me that they gave us afterwards. And we sat down at that meeting, and she said, right, you know, we've got a lot of concerns about your situation. And I've got the letter out of storage, which I'll show you on the camera. There it is. Just to prove that it exists. Because I wanted to remind myself when we did this exactly what they essentially denied us on. So they said, you're not going through to stage 1, and this is why. You're not going through stage 1, this is why. They referenced our finances, because we're not by any means rich. You know, we're not. I mean, we're not on the poverty line, but you know, we both had at the time very normal, what you would call normal jobs. I'm a quote unquote warehouse manager. It's got a fancy job title, but it's basically a warehouse manager. My wife worked in childcare, so like, you know, we're okay, but we're not going to be sort of buying yachts in the Bahamas or anything like that. We had some debt, as a lot of people do, and we had some savings, but they were like, we don't think you've got enough savings, which is a bit ironic, because at the start they said it doesn't matter whether you have savings or not, as long as you're able to budget. It doesn't matter how much money you've got. But they immediately went, well, we don't think you've got enough savings to basically adopt a child. Then they said, we're worried about the home, because we think that we're not happy with you not owning the house, because my mum owns the house. Although that's due to change actually soon, but because my mum owns the deeds of the house, they were like, we're not happy with that, because she can kick you out. So if you're willing to get your mother to sign the deeds to you, then that's fine. But unless you do that, we're not going to do it. And I was like, well, you can't tell my mother to sign her house over. Like, that's a ridiculous standpoint for start, but there you go. And then the final thing was what they dubbed as the resolution of not parenting through parenting a birth child. Which, with the benefit of hindsight, in fairness to them, I can understand that, because it did look a bit like, because there was a discussion, because at the point we hadn't had that final fertility assessment where they determined that we could not ever naturally have children. So at the time they did ask a question quite specific, and it said, if you were to have a birth child, say 4 years down the line, what would you do? And we're like, well, obviously we'd raise both children. You know, that's, you know, and they were like, would you stop trying for a birth child? And we're like, well, you know, to be frank about it, we don't use contraception now. We've not had one yet. We're probably not going to suddenly start using contraception just for the fun of it. So if it happens, I suppose it happens, but like, it's not on our radar. And they weren't happy with that. And I can understand that point. So to slightly defend the LA, that point does at least have a bit of logic, because obviously, as I now understand the complication of of the relationships there, it would have been an interesting one. I mean, I still think we could have dealt with it, but I can understand their standpoint on it. The other two, I'll be quite honest, I reject wholeheartedly. And I think, as we'll discuss in a second, with the new agency we went with, they said as much. So I think we were vindicated in that. Okay. And obviously we've got the end of our journey now, so everyone knows that in the long term, these are not issues. But they wrote us a 2-page letter to sign us off from stage 1, and said, if you want to come back in 6 months, we'll be willing to see you again. But that's it. And my wife was very, very upset at that meeting, crying her eyes out. And this, I suppose, is a slightly not nasty side of me, but a very bullheadedness of me, because the last thing I said to him is I stood up and I said, look, if you think this is the end of our journey just because you're saying no, you can forget yourself. Like, I'll go and find someone else who will take us. If you're not interested in doing it, I will go and find someone else who will do it, which is very sort of pig-headed of me, very bullheaded of me, and maybe not entirely realistic and very emotional at the time, I suppose, although, it worked out in the end. But when we set our minds to something, we were very stubborn about kind of going through with it, and we weren't going to let that stop us, that's for sure. But it was a testy meeting, should we say. The final meeting was very testy. I
mean, what's interesting about that is because we hear about these stories. I mean, they don't happen all the time, but we do hear, Al and I hear from people quite a lot who have been refused to go through to stage two. And what becomes clear, and I don't think we've ever gone back to somebody and said this, but I'm going to ask you, because you seem really open about it.
Yeah.
Do you think there was like one issue that was underlying that kind of, because obviously they're going to then pick up on every small thing potentially that's a negative. Do you think there was one thing, or do you think that there was literally a couple of things, or
I think having the benefit of a bit of having the benefit of reflection, I reckon that I think they definitely were concerned, and I think that's legitimate. They were concerned about unresolved birth child, situation, and and as I say, with the benefit of hindsight now, at the time it made me furious. I won't deny that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've said barely anything in that final meeting, except what I just said there. And I was so angry. I was like, if I say something, I'm just going to have a go at them, and that's not fair to them. They're doing their jobs. So I suspect that was a big problem initially. And I definitely think was the motivation behind the other problems, so to speak. Finances, I guess, maybe a little. I can understand it because we've been lucky. Well, not really lucky, because unfortunately it took a family death to get there, but we've been lucky that our debts have mainly disappeared now. But at the time we had quite a few. So I can at least understand the logic of that. Although it's, as I say, it's a bit galling when they sort of open the thing of, well, yeah, don't worry about finances. It doesn't matter as long as you can prove you can budget. And we wrote out a budget form. So it's not like we didn't demonstrate we could afford it. So I don't know, really, if I'm honest. I'm not sure. I mean, I can only assume it's maybe due to the unresolved birth child issue, and the rest just kind of piled on because they needed, or they found little bugs here and there with the rest of it. I suppose from a housing perspective, again, giving them the benefit of the doubt, the house wasn't quite ready. I mean, we would have had it ready in time had we have got to the end of the stage 2 that year. I have no doubt about that, because we did when we were in stage 1 with the other agency. But I can see maybe when they walked in, they could look at that sort of semi-building site and go, well, hang on a minute, they're not prepared for this yet. I'm not sure, we're a bit worried about it. And there's just little things. I mean, it's a difficult one. My interpretation, I think, to slightly insult the LAs, because I'm sure there are great ones, but the one round here, obviously I have history with now, so I can only judge it on my own history. I think that the system they were using was quite antiquated to a certain extent, and the people, at least our social worker, could not understand certain aspects of what I would consider modern living. So to give you an example of that, my friendship circle is mainly based online. Like, I'm a massive video game nerd. My friendship circle is scattered around the country, and I communicate with them on the internet because, I mean, aside from the pandemic, I can't trip up to Scotland every 5 minutes to see my friends. So when they were sort of saying, well, who's your friendship circle? Who's your support network? I mean, these friends are like, I would tell them anything. They would support me if I needed it. So they are as good as a friend to me as someone who you would live 2 doors down from and you've known all your life. But I think they really struggle with that concept, for example, because they were like, well, when are you going down the pub with them? And I'm not. They live around the country. I'm not going down the pub with them. Like, well, what do you do? I'm like, I play games with them. And I'm like, well, is that social? I'm like, well, yeah. This is modern social interactivity. I'm a nerd. I don't want to go to the pub. It's not, I want to sit at home in front of my computer and play some games with my mates, And there's little things like that where it struck me as the system is obviously the system in itself, I mean, I think you guys have discussed it many times in the podcast. The system of adoption, if you want to call it that, or the process of adoption was sort of, I guess, popularized, mainly created, whatever you want to call it, in the sort of 40s and 50s, so to speak. And it's never quite evolved beyond its original creation. So there's sort of, I think when you get thrown up with certain modern complexities, like the example of living with your mother because you can't afford to move out in the area you live, they don't know how to deal with it. And that's not entirely their fault, but I don't know. I mean, that's probably someone more smarter than I will figure that out.
And way smarter than me as well. So let's not worry about that. But I guess I get what you mean. I mean, no different to when the law changed for single people and same-sex couples. It took them a while to get their heads around this new thing. And we know. I'm sure that you're the same. The one thing that everybody worries about is social media with these children, because contact and all that sort of stuff. So I guess it's you live your life how you live it, and it's what.
Well, it's interesting because I know that you said on the podcast very recently, just to slightly timestamp this, sorry, timestamps, that when you first went through the process, one of the social workers said to you, well, you can't adopt boys because we think you might be pedophiles. Or there'd be concerns about that, which, I mean, just absolutely agog when I heard that, because I was like, what a stupid statement that is. But I suppose, as you say, it was new. They didn't understand it. And I think the advent of technology in our case, with that little point there, is the same thing. They just don't understand it. I mean, to slightly timestamp this social worker, because I'm sure she's a lovely person, but she was sort of in her 70s. I think she was nearly retired. So she, because she was working part-time, she's like 2 days a week. She's not the sort of person who's going to be sitting online playing games. So her concept of my lifestyle is probably like, what a weirdo, which to me is completely normal, but to them is not. So it's just interesting, I suppose. It's just, I think, well, if you want me to carry on, I can. But it highlights the difference, I think, between the LA and then our experience with the, I suppose you call them voluntary private agency. I can't remember what the terminology for that is.
So it was a voluntary adoption agency.
Yeah, voluntary adoption agency.
A VA. Yeah. So tell us about that then. Move on from this negative into clearly what may have become quite positive.
It took a little bit of time. I mean, the current agency we're with, adopted with, whatever way you want to phrase that, took us a couple of months to find them. But essentially the pig-headedness, we went straight out and started looking for agencies, and we got a short list of probably about 6 or 7 in the local area. And a bit further afield, to be fair. And we rang. I mean, Bernardos is one we rang. They weren't interested in speaking to us at all. We were honest about it. We said, listen, we've been rejected from stage 1 from the local authority, and this is why. So we've never lied about that with any of the agencies, because the whole point was, if we're going to go with an agency, they've got to understand, because to be frank about it, we're not going to sit there and do 4 months worth of paperwork again if they're all going to say no for the same reasons. So we'd rather be upfront about it. So Bernardos basically said no. I can't remember why they said no, but they just weren't interested in even looking to take us on stage 1 for one of the reasons cited, or many of them, I can't remember, to be honest. We contacted one that's a very small agency local to here, and we met the lady who ran that face-to-face, because that's when you could do that sort of thing. And she was what I like, and you'll notice this, because there's really no topic off limits for me. I'm quite open about a lot of things, almost 99.9% of things anyway. And I think, communication is better with honesty. There's no point people fudging around and pretending things are not the way they are. And I like this about her, because we sat down and she said, just look, we gave her the letter from the local authority, and we said, this is what they've rejected us for. And she said, right, well, she goes, I would completely ignore all that. She's like, I'm not worried about any of that. But she goes, I wouldn't take you through because you're overweight. And she's like, you wouldn't pass with me for overweight. And but some people would say that and go, wow, that's rude. I was like, that's brilliant, because she's honest. And I'm not, she's not wasting my time. She's been honest about it. She's not willing to take us. And she said, come back. You lose weight and come back. and we'll speak. We never did, but I appreciated the honesty of it. And she sort of highlighted reasons why. I mean, she was sort of saying there was a London person who had come up or something, and he'd been like, oh yeah, I'm fine, but he was coming to her after drinking 5 gins on the first class train from London to thing. And she was like, well, you have an alcohol problem. He's like, no, I don't. And she was like, all these things are important. You have to, I have to take you on if I'm happy. And in that case, I wasn't happy. And in this case, I'm not. So really appreciated that from her. And in the end, we found the agency we were with, which I don't know, I can name them if people want me to. But
what you feel comfortable with?
Well, they're called Adopters for Adoption, or AFA. Okay, I was abbreviated to AFA.
I know who they are.
And that's who we ended up going with. And we gave them the letter. To be honest, they said, well, we're not sure, but let's start some stage 1 and we'll see where we go. And I don't know, for better or worse, I guess we got a social worker who I will name because she's so lovely. Her name is Karen, because she's still in touch with us now, and we've basically become friends with her. She's that sort of social worker, and only today we messaged her because my son actually had some minor surgery today in his ears to put grommets in. She was messaging like, tell me about the grommet surgery. Did it go okay? So, and the second she walked into our house, we absolutely struck it off. And it was the bipolar opposite of how we felt with the LA. And I think that's really, really highlighted to us that like, we've got the right thing here. She was honest. She always is. She's brutally honest. But she does it for a reason. And really appreciate everything that she did and AFA did. And we basically started with them in August of 2019, and we zimmed through stage 1 like our feet didn't hit the ground, and we were informed in October that we'd be moving to stage 2. So it gives you an idea how quickly we went through stage 1 with them, although we didn't actually move to stage 2 at that point. We'd just been told we were gonna. But they're like, stage 1's fine, like we completely reject everything on the council's letter, like the local authority's letter, don't worry about any of that. She tells the apocryphal tale, which I don't know if it's true, that she apparently went, which is apparently standard practice, but she went to the local authority and dug our file out of the local authority so she could assess that we were telling her the truth, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah. So
she
have to do some checks, don't they? If you've been through the process elsewhere, they do have to do.
So she went all the way to our local authority, and the tale she tells, which I love as a story, but I don't know if it's true or not. But she's standing there reading our file, and the person who wrote the letter to us, the assistant head of the child services or whatever, came in, and they know each other because obviously she's been a social worker for a number of years. They kind of vaguely know each other. And she said, oh, what are you here for? And she's like, I'm doing a records check on James and Joe, which is my wife. And she goes, all right, okay, yeah. So they've gone with you then. And she's like, yeah, weird kind of thing. And she went through the letter with them, and she said, I don't know why you wrote that letter. That was stupid. And the head of the assistant head of the service going, well, it felt like the right choice at the time. And apparently, and this is why I love it because it's a mic drop moment, apparently she put the file back in the drawer, shut the drawer, went, well, your loss is our gain, see ya, and then just left, apparently. And I just love the image of that. I don't know whether she was just doing that to big us up, but the imagery on that just worked so well for me that I was just like, okay.
So, that is interesting. And that's quite a journey to get to that stage, to be fair. So what were you thinking about adoption by the time you got to stage 2 with AFA?
Well, that's interesting because I think I definitely, me personally, because again, my wife's journey is no doubt slightly different from mine. And I won't pretend to speak for her. In the meantime, so when we sort of had done the introduction session, and I said this before we started recording, I found your podcast somewhere. And I've been a consumer of your podcast since that day. And I went back and I downloaded loads of old episodes. And I'll tell you, it absolutely did change my... The rose tinted glasses definitely came down, and the more realistic view of adoption started to appear. I think it's still a little bit rose tinting even in my life now, but I'm kind of halfway between the two now, I would say. I think there's certain things I look at and I'm like, that's individual to that person's story, and the likelihood of that happening to me might be slim. And then there's other things where I'm absolutely like, do you know what? They're nail hit on the head right there. Completely understand it, completely agree with it. And I was much more and I think also because we did the 2 to 3 days training in October when we got told we were going to stage 2. And that, again, was a real eye-opener because, and I don't know, obviously I can't comment on other people's services, how they do that, but the AFA version of that was brutally honest and really, really good. Right. There's still a little bit of, encouragement to not completely terrify everybody, but they really didn't mince their words when they were talking about the certain things you might come across, the trauma you might come across, all sorts of tasks we did on those. I mean, they stressed the importance of a name, where they made us all stand in front of the group, and why was our name given to us. And then they did the what I call the baby thread, which people might know, where they had the baby with the little strings coming out of it, and they're like, right, that's birth mum, this is birth dad, this is social, and then drop all the threads, and that's how many connections that child has made in their short life. And that especially, when I saw that, I was like, Jesus, they have made a lot of connections that they've just lost. Like, that really did open my eyes to some of those things, for sure. So yeah, I definitely had started to change. By the time we got to the end of stage 1 with AFA, I think I personally was much more realistic about certain aspects of adoption. We kind of pitched ourselves in the mindset that we were looking. I know people hate it when people say this, but it's the honest truth for us, so why not? But we'd really pitched ourselves as like 1 to 4 year old child. We really didn't want to go much older than 4. We're in our mid-30s. It's always the category that everyone goes, I want a baby. And we were sort of in that mindset a little still. But we're quite happy with going for a child of 4. We felt we could handle that perfectly fine. And my wife is a Senko trained practitioner. So, there's certain things where we're like, well, we're more prepared than some other people would be for certain things. So yeah, coming out of the training days, I would say, a lot more realism about the process, for sure. And then, the rest kind of stop-started, really, but I suppose breezing through it super quick because it is a stop-start. We started stage 2 in February of 2020, right when the pandemic started. That was good. Surprisingly, pandemics did not affect stage 2 that much, so that was okay because we'd already done the training. So the pandemic really didn't affect stage 2 that much. We just, apart from the fact that every meeting was done with face masks on, because at that point people still weren't quite, I guess, sure of the fear that was of the COVID. Then. Yeah. Well, we started in February, so it kind of lockdown fell kind of right in the middle towards the end of stage 2. Yeah. Right. And we did a lot more over the phone then and FaceTime with the social worker, Karen, at that point. But it kind of, stage 2 went quite quick. I mean, we were basically, the final approval was May in 2020. That's when we got approved to be adopters. And then the rest of the time was a whirlwind, really, because we got approved, and within, I haven't written down the time because, to be honest, I can't be 100% sure, but I reckon within maybe a week and a half, we'd already found who would become our son, the child that would become our son. And we'd put in information requests because they approved us and immediately gave us the link maker link. They were like, here's link maker, you've been approved, go. And we're like, okay, sure, we can do that. And that's a really hard part. Like, it's really hard to look at the files and obviously see the stories some of these children have had and the things they've gone through and their prospects for their future in some cases. And you have to really, I suppose, man yourself up to coin the phrase and really be ruthless about it in a realistic way. We looked at a file for a little girl, bless her. My heart still goes out to her, but she had so many complex needs. She was only 2, and she was already wheelchair bound, fed through a tube, had all sorts of physical disabilities, lots of suspected mental disabilities to come down the line later in her life. And we just listened. We're like, we just can't take on that much. For example, like that was just too much for us to I guess feel we could handle, for lack of a better terminology. And it really breaks your heart because, like, I mean, again, the rose-tinted glasses come down a little bit more because it's like, oh man, all these kids need help. They need someone to, you know, some of these children are going to be stuck in the care system now until they're 18, and then, depending on your opinion of the care system, thrown out on the street, which is not fair, you know, and they need someone to advocate and help them, but that just can't be us. And that was really hard. I mean, we really did sort of struggle with some of those, like just that emotion of trying to get through that and be practical yet ruthless, yet also have those emotions coming through. But we kind of got lucky really with, we'll call him Little Legs because that's his nickname. His nickname through the process was Little Legs. We got kind of lucky, I guess, with Little Legs in the respect of we'd looked at some other profiles, and then his profile we looked at the same time that our social worker sent it to us. So it was a really weird, like, fate thing. And not to reveal his name completely because I don't know it's fair to him, but his middle name is my first name, which people can see on the podcast or whatever. And it just felt like fate. It really did. Like it's, I'm sure people who go through the process have the same thing, but we looked at his profile and it felt like it was meant to be the second we saw his picture. And it's a really bizarre feeling when you think about the fact that really there's no blood tie, obviously. You know, he has his own first family, which, you know, he's, in this case, obviously he'd been removed from, but for the reasons he was. But it was, really, really something to sort of see that picture for the first time. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I wasn't sure the timescales on this. So was introductions when were they within restrictions and stuff, or how did that work?
Yeah, so we found his profile in the May, right after we got approved as adopters. We first saw pictures of him at home, which was all done via WhatsApp because there was no visiting or anything like that. We saw pictures of him at home from his carer because he was in foster care at that point and had been for a year. He was, it's his story, it's his to tell, but
of course,
he was essentially removed at 4 days old. So he'd been in foster care from 4 days old. So at this point he'd spent a year in foster care pretty much. So his foster carer sent us some pictures of him chewing a phone, which is slightly odd, but but again, like, he just looked cute as a button. So we saw pictures of him in the June, and June to July. So at that point we said, listen, we want to, you know, we'd like to adopt him. We think this is going to be a fit. Let's talk about it. You know, let's go from there. June to July, we spent all the time talking to the foster carer via WhatsApp because, again, no face-to-face stuff. And we had endless amounts of pictures thrown at us from her, which is a lovely lady. She just throwing pictures left, right, and centre. Talked a lot about his needs, although because he was so young, I think what will become relevant is that we've now discovered he had a lot more needs than he actually was demonstrating at the time. And then we actually went to matching panel on the 12th of August. 12th of August 2020 was matching panel, which we obviously passed or succeeded in, whichever way you want to phrase that. I don't know what the terminology is for that, but it all went fine.
I can't remember now. I think it's still approved or whatever it's called, or matched or whatever it is.
Match was approved. Yeah, we'll go with that. Match was approved on the 12th of August 2020. And because it was COVID, we went into isolation for 2 weeks because we couldn't do face-to-faces until you'd been in isolation for 2 weeks. So yeah, we went to isolation 2 weeks. We had a real, so just before matching panel, we'd had the panel date given to us, but obviously with COVID, everything was chaos. And as you can probably imagine, it was all online anyway. So the actual approval for becoming an adopter was a Zoom call, as was the matching panel. And the matching panel, they were really struggling, I think, to logistically gather everyone round to do these Zoom calls, probably. and I booked the isolation time off work and the 1 week of introductions, and I'd also booked. I had paternity leave for I think another 2 weeks if I remember the timer, and then I booked another month off basically of holiday. I'd saved my holiday because I was like, I'm going to really, again, listening to the podcast, understanding the adoption process, where I was like, I'm going to bond with this. I'm going to bond with this child till he doesn't like it anymore. He's going to be bonded, damn it. So I was like, I'm going to take as much time off as possible so we can have a proper family time. Obviously we were fairly cognizant we weren't going anywhere, I guess, because at that point the pandemic was in full force. But, I wanted to be there for my wife and our new child, and I wanted to really bond with him. I wanted, and have the whole family thing going on. So about a week before matching panel, they rang us up and said, oh, yeah, we need to push the matching panel back by 2 weeks. So I walked into my boss's office and I said, I need to move my entire holiday of 7 weeks, which you've planned cover for, because the job I do, I'm the only one that does it. So he had to bring in temporary staff to cover my work. I need to push that back 2 weeks. There was a lot of tension in the office that day. And basically my boss just said, no. He just said, no, I'm not moving it. I can't move it. I've booked the temp. You can't, you're just going to have to deal with it. So the reason our matching panel stayed on the 12th of August is because I rang them up and I said, look, you got to keep it because I cannot move my holiday and I'm not missing out on bonding time with this child because you lot haven't been able to organize it. And I'm quite a chill guy. I'm fairly ambivalent about a lot of things because I don't like being overly stressed because I think stress will kill you, frankly. So I'm quite chill about a lot of things in life, but there are times when I can get quite bullish, and that was another one of those moments where I essentially forced them to keep that matching date because I was like, I can't move it, it's not thing. So yeah, we did that on 12th of August, went into isolation for 2 weeks, and then we did introductions on the 2nd of September. Now, anyone who understands accents will probably recognise my accent as being from the south of England. My son comes from pretty much as far in the north of England as you can get before you get to Scotland, which in a pandemic is an interesting drive when there's nobody about, and then you're shoved in a hotel for a week. And we got to be fair, we got put in one hotel and they ended up changing it because the hotel just wasn't suitable for him to come back to, because part of the discussion was, he can't come home with you. Because normally, if you live locally, of course, what they do is they say, right, you take him home for this day, and they're like, well, obviously you can't do that because it's 6-hour drive or whatever. You need to bring him to the hotel. But the first hotel was just not going to be at all suitable. So we got lucky because this was sort of done off our back. We rang the owner of the hotel and we just said, listen, it was like an Airbnb type place. We're like, have you got any other properties that we can go to that's going to be more suitable? And the guy was so lovely because it turns out he himself was a fellow adopter, which we didn't know at the time. And he said, "Oh, what are you coming up for?" And we're like, "Oh, well, we're adopting a boy from your area." And he was like, "Oh, give me 20 minutes, I'll find you somewhere else." And then he rang back and he was like, "Yeah, you can have this place." And he just gave us another hotel just a little bit further up the road that he had, or another Airbnb type place that was much more suitable. So that's when we did the introductions, did a week of introductions. I think we got left alone with him after 2 days. Got on like a house on fire with the foster carer. Lovely, lovely lady. Still talk to her literally every day. My wife does. So I'm too lazy. But the missus is absolutely the communications person, so she keeps in touch with her on a nearly daily basis. Really, like, he'd been in such a great home. Like, they'd looked after him so well. She'd had him since he was removed at this 4 days old. And it was actually her first foster child too, so she was completely new to it. And when we first turned up, there was that slightly awkward moment of, we're sitting in her house, We don't quite know what we're supposed to be doing. No social workers were there because it was social distancing. So they were just like, you guys can do it. You'll be all right. Yeah. You just turn up at our house. So we're just knocking this random woman's door going, hi, we're here to meet Little Legs.
Wow. What an experience.
We sort of sat in the lounge. She's like, well, what do we do now? I'm like, I don't know. Do you know? She's like, I have no idea. Like, I've never done an introduction before. So we sort of played that by ear. And I think she ended up going out for the day after 2 days, and we just had him in her house. And we just like, oh, we're in a random person's house. She's gone out for the day and we're looking after him. But again, I mean, we're lucky really, because my wife is I mean, she was born to look after children, and hence why her career path is where it went. And like, you know, whatever I'm not very good at, and I would say at that point, I'm much better even in a year now at caring for a child than I would have been then. I did do some childcare stuff before we actually were approved, but it's a whole different ballgame when you have to do it practically on a day-to-day sort of basis. And those introductions, my wife came into her own because I was there sort of like thrusting the baby at me, and I'm like, okay, what do I do with this child now? Do I check his bum? Do I feed him? Is he hungry? And she's like, he's not hungry. He's just go and play with him. I'm like, all right, okay. So I'm sort of playing with him on the floor or whatever. But there's some, lovely little pictures of, I mean, he fell asleep in my arms on the first day we were there. And it's like one of those Kodak picture moments, which is lovely for us anyway.
And clearly is framed somewhere in your house, because that is.
Yeah, I think it is, so he came home on the 8th of September 2020. And after him being home for a bit, we formally adopted him on the 31st of March 2021, was the day the court ruled the adoption final. And he's obviously got his first family. We absolutely strongly and fiercely believe that he needs to have contact with them. I don't know if you want to delve into the subject of contact at some point in this discussion, but contact.
I'd be interested to when you come back on, because I think that, you know, you're so like, I hadn't realised you're just a year into this, and you've been so candid and so honest already. And I would be really interested to revisit this, and especially from the fact of like the pandemic side as well, and how that may have, you know, how that may turn into a different experience for you in terms of the longer term stuff, because you've got a story to tell him, number one, about, you know, the fact that like your instructions were different and all that sort of stuff when he's older. I'm not saying the podcast is going to be around in 10 years.
We can do it in we can certainly have a deeper discussion on it at any point. I mean, I'm an open book, but one thing I can bullet point it for you absolutely is introductions and him coming home and all that. You get used to being isolationist in the middle of the pandemic, let me tell you. The social workers may as well not have been in existence at that point. Like, I mean, to be fair, the AFA social worker, Karen, brilliant, always on the phone. She was there whenever we needed her. Yeah. His side, the local, because he was obviously under the care of local authority, his local authority carers, I mean, well... I don't really. I'll try and be polite. Shambles might be the politest way I can phrase it. Since we first met him, he went through. Hang on, I'll do you a quick count here. When we first saw his pictures in June, he went through 1, 2, 3, 4 social workers. So between June and March this year, he went through 4 social workers. And almost none of them knew his file. I mean, to the point where one of them actually rang me up because we were obviously querying lots of things, and he had a lot of medical referrals waiting when he came basically south with us. Yeah. And we were obviously chasing them for news on these referrals and what was happening with them. And to the point where one of the guys said, "Well, what's his medical status now?" And I was like, "Don't you know? You've got the file." And he was like, "Well, yeah, but, you know, I haven't read it." And I'm like, "What do you mean you haven't read it? You're ringing me. I'm ringing you to ask for help, and you don't even know what I'm asking help about." Yeah. And he was like, "Yeah." I was like, "Oh, just come on." You know, and some of it's pandemic related. I think maybe just the area itself is in a bit of crisis, because from what we understand from the foster carer, it's not much better on the foster carer side either. Right now in that particular local authorities area. So it might just be a real crisis for that local authority. I don't pretend to fully understand that, but yeah, I mean, he's home. You know, we plod along. There's a lot of roads still. I mean, he's been recently diagnosed with autism, so we've got a long road for him for his entire life when it comes to that diagnosis, obviously.
Yeah.
Because we don't quite know how that's all going to manifest yet. It's quite an early diagnosis for autism, which we did privately because trying to get an NHS one in the middle of the pandemic is a nightmare. And he really needs to get educational healthcare plans and things sorted.
Yeah.
Because, you know, again, beauty of having a Senko worker, like the second, after a few months of being with us, my wife was like, I think he might have autism. Like, again, that wasn't on his file. His file was basically listed as a lot of question marks, which is fine by us, but you know, we're obviously now dealing with all that, so still a road to go, still a long road to go.
So after all that, because I've asked you 2 questions about your views on adoption at the start, in the middle, so obviously you have a son now, but what are your views on adoption now?
God, don't let the internet come after me. I think no. Listen, it's a
your
device.
Story. Listen, it's your story.
Yeah, I think adoption as a subject is a very divisive thing, right? And I think you guys highlight it a lot on the podcast. There's a large swathe of the population that really don't understand what you would call the realism of adoption, or what I would call the realism of adoption, rather. I mean, even some of my friends now are just like, oh, so we'll write a letter to his. We've got letterbox contact with his birth mother, which unfortunately she has yet to write back, but we write our side, because I think it's important, and we're trying very hard with the social workers actually to help her to craft some letters back to him. But anyway, that's another story. But you know, even now, like I'll say to my friends, oh, I'm doing the letterbox this week for Little Legs, and my friend's like, why are you bothering to write to his mum? She lost him. It doesn't matter. Yeah. And I'm like, but it does matter. It matters to him and it matters to her. Yeah. Like, it's not just for, I mean, it is for him, but it's also for her. I mean, she needs to understand that he's safe. Yeah. And that he's cared for, and that, you know, the things she gave him, because she has given him, I mean, she hasn't seen him basically since he was removed, really, but she did give him some things at the first Christmas he was in care. And that's all kept for him in a memory box. You know, and she has to understand that stuff's been kept, and he's going to see it when he's old enough to understand it. Because obviously, at the minute he's not going to know it from Adam. But when he's old enough, and it's the little. I think it's maybe the little touches that people have to understand. So, in his bedroom, we have which is, I don't know if everyone does this or it's just an us thing, but we thought it was a great idea, and I hadn't seen anyone else do it, but I'm sure others do. We've got a wall of all the photos of everyone significant in his life. Right. So it's got his foster carer, it's got the foster carer's children, because they obviously were there when he was raised with them. It's got one of his birth siblings, because he's one of 5. So it's got one of his birth siblings who met him after he was born. It will eventually have one of his other birth siblings who's since sent us a picture from the letterbox, but we haven't put that on the wall yet. It's got his birth mum, and it's got our family, me and my wife, like the grandparents on our side. And any pictures we get from the birth family will be added to that wall. And on the top of it, it literally just has a phrase where it says family, something like family where life begins, love starts, or something like, you know, vaguely romanticized. But and then in the top of this sort of triangle of pictures is his picture, slap bang in the middle. Right. So that what we're hoping, and I think it's, you know, important to us, because we quite often after a bath we'll take him and show him the pictures, and he laughs at them because he doesn't know what they are in a minute. We'll look at him and just laugh, and he started pointing at our pictures now. He goes dad, 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 that sort of thing. But he's not very vocal yet, so he just finds it funny, I guess. But you know, it's important because when he grows up, we can say to him, look, this is your birth mummy, and this is who she was, and blah blah blah, and we can slowly build that up for his life. And I think people don't quite understand the practicality of that in what you might call the normal world, and why you'd have to do it. Because he has a past. I mean, it's only not a very long past given how quickly he was removed, but it's still important for him to know that he has another family out there who care for him. He may not get to meet all of those. I mean, there's several, obviously, as I say, he's one of 5, and to be honest, I don't think we'll certainly won't hear from one of them, because their adoptive parents are just Annie letterbox for everybody, not just us, from what we understand anyway. He's got 2 siblings who are in like permanent foster care, one of whom has written once, the other one I believe is aware of him but doesn't seem to be being encouraged to write back. And another one is in kinship care. So, and originally they were quite interested apparently in having contact, but that seems to have disappeared. I don't quite know why. And the social workers don't seem to know either. But again, it's like getting blood from a stone with try and get a social worker to answer a question at the minute. So we keep pushing, but there has to become a certain point where you have to go, listen, we can't keep pushing for this. We've got to move on with his life and our life, and he will know about them, but we can't keep pushing to try and make these people write back or contact back, but you can at least know what we know. And I've already built up a file ready for, I mean, people say it's when they're 18. I'll probably give it to him way before that, to be brutally honest, if I think he can comprehend it, but he'll have his file in it. The bread and butter file that we've got. Everything else we know about his entire story is going to be in that file. And at age appropriate times, bits will be drip fed. And then when he's, say, 16, 17, I'll judge it at the time, it will be very much like, right, here's the file, let's sit down and read the nuts and bolts of this together. Because, I mean, his story's, I mean, every adoption story is, I suppose, from a standpoint, is sad, because otherwise they'd be left with their birth family, right? I mean, adoption is not there's a phrasing for this and I don't want to get it wrong. Adoption is a privilege, not a right. Is how I like to think of it. And I'm sure, I feel like you guys have said that before in a podcast, to be honest, but it's stuck with me. And I think, we're privileged to raise this child. Has it given us what we wanted, which is a family? Yes. And that's kind of the selfish aspects of adoption from our perspective, because we wanted a family and this has been a route to getting a family. And he is, I don't think of him as anything other than my son. I would never would. Whereas some people, I suppose, would be a bit more, and I don't like that, people who are specifically like, oh, that's my adopted child. No, he's my son and that's the way it goes. But you also have to be cognizant he's got that other family. If he wants contact with his birth mum at some point, face to face, then, we'll facilitate that for him. In his case, it's going to depend a lot on what he understands, because he's very, very globally delayed. He may be 2 physically, but his development age right now is below 1. So it gives you an idea of how far back he is. How that will develop as he grows up will depend, I suppose, on where his interest lies with any of that sort of stuff. And whatever he wants to do, we'll support him with it. That's just what it comes down to. I think my wife finds that a bit trickier than I do. I'm quite happy to speak from that, because I know that. Having a birth mum, definitely she struggles with it more than I would, because she's the mum now, she's the adopted mum. So if, she quite often will pull herself, if I ever go, oh yeah, his mum, because I don't tend to designate birth mum as anything other than just mum quite a lot of the time. And my wife, I think, struggles with that more, because if I go, oh yeah, his mum, she'll go, no, birth mum. And I'm like, I know she's birth mum, but it's still his mum. Like, I know you're not quite ready for this conversation. We'll keep moving on. She definitely struggles with that. And I've got the unique perspective, and she says this to me, I've got the unique thing because his birth dad has never been in the picture. Nobody knows who he is. I mean, she's given them a name, but nobody knows who it is. They can't find him. So I suppose as a father, I get off lighter, right? Because I don't have the quote unquote or whatever perspective of fear that this other dad might appear and destroy my happy son dad relationship. But I also don't think I would view it like that, because I'm just too ambivalently chill to care. Like, I think, he has got a dad. I mean, like, somebody was involved in the process, right? So whether he ever finds out who it is or not, or meets him or not, is another thing. But you've got to understand where these children have come from. And I try very hard to get my friends to understand that, because some understand it better than others, but I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, adoption. I think, it
is. Yeah,
and it's very divisive, and it's all so personal too. It's so, because it's such a personal journey. I mean, I saw on Twitter only yesterday that or was it day before, you'd had a commenter on one of your posts who was very anti-adoption in there, and they put a whole diatribe of anti-adoption stuff.
Oh, okay.
Which is fine. I mean, they're entitled to their opinion. It doesn't bother me. I don't know them. And they made a point. But they'd written it as a perspective of they were an adoptee who had suffered at the hands of their adopter. And obviously that's personal to them. That's their personal journey. And, they're entitled to their opinions how they want. I still think adoption's a good thing. If you want my standpoint on the state of adoption, I think it's an unfortunate necessity, but I think it in the respect there's a necessity, it's a good thing that it exists for the children that need it. I wish there was more children that didn't need it. And that comes down to something on a much grander political scale than I'm qualified to comment on, I think. I mean, could my son have stayed with his birth mother if she'd had the right support? I actually would probably say yes, to be honest. I don't think he arguably didn't need to be removed at 4 days old but it's such a difficult one because there were obviously 4 other children that, in this case, that had been removed already.
Yeah. And
breaking that cycle is very difficult for a birth mother, and that's not fair. But then now that he's got these complex needs developing, I'm not sure she would have been able to handle the complex needs he seems to be slowly developing through. By the flip side of that, so whilst I'll defend her, I'll also slightly undefend her at the same time. It's so complex.
Yeah. Well, do you know what I think is really interesting about this conversation? Because, like I said, I didn't realise just how early on you were in terms of the journey. So I honestly believe that we should revisit this conversation at some point in time. Maybe not straight away. It's a little bit like, that program that was on telly about revisiting families after they had children after certain levels of time. Because I think it's so intriguing. Your experience is very different to my experience in terms of when, like in this time, if you like, because you've done things very differently. But I think it'd be really interesting to come back to this if you wouldn't mind coming back on at some point, maybe in I don't know,
happy to,
a couple of years, maybe. I'm not saying 7 years like Child of Our Time or whatever that program was called.
I mean, you never know. In 2 or 3 years, I might be bold. I mean, I'm fairly bold now, as you see on the camera, but I might have ripped all my hair out and be like, oh my God, I can't believe why have I done this? Why did I just start my family this way?
Yeah. I mean, I'm 15 years in, I've still got hair. Al hasn't got hair, but then
mine was fast on its way out before this process, let me tell you. But the process definitely didn't help it. But no, I'm more than happy to come back at any point. Yeah, and I think, cool. I mean, I'm fairly open about anything. I think you can't solve a problem by everybody closeting themselves away and never, or not a problem, but like you can't solve anything or understand anything by closeting yourselves away and not being open to a discussion about it. And there's, whether you choose to agree or not on a subject, if you can get, I mean, that's absolutely, I'm going to slightly plug your podcast, but if people were hearing this, they've probably already heard your podcast. But the benefit of listening to things like these conversations is you're not just doing adopters, you're doing adoptees, you've done some kinship, you've done some foster carers, you've kind of covered lots of the spectrum, and each one of those people has a different perspective and a different story to tell. And by listening to those, people can understand. Like, there's plenty of times I've listened to all those things, and there's bits where people have said something and I've been talking in the car to it, and I've gone, no, that person's just blowing that out of proportion. It can't have been that bad, or whatever. Why would you let that happen if you did this or blah blah, but then at the same time, there's bits where you're like, well, yeah, I suppose that's right. You come round and you go, oh yeah, okay. I mean, it's difficult because you're obviously looking in the outside in. So you're looking at someone else's life and then trying to figure out what you agree or disagree with. And then you've got the overall process, whether you agree or disagree with it. So yeah, it's a really interesting topic. And adoption is fascinating to me. And I think people need to understand it more than they do now, for sure. The general populace rather than people in it, because I think like we all understand bits of it, although we can always learn. But the general populace definitely needs the sort of rose-tinted nature of adoption removing, I think, and they need to, it's not all bad, but they need to understand the nitty gritty, so to speak, of it as well, and some of the real things people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. As you say, I'm lucky. I mean, like, my son is 2. Like, the worst thing he's going to do right now is wake up in 2 minutes, and because he's, pooed his nappy in the night, or I mean, I've been hit in the head by a couple of toy trucks. That's like about as bad as it gets on a day-to-day basis, because he's so young. But maybe, as you say, in 5 years it might be a different story. I might be saying, well, I still enjoy it, but I really wish he'd stop X, Y, or Z, or we've all just got to go on our journeys, right?
Well, let's do that. Let's not focus too much on any negatives right now, because if you're if you've got that positives, then definitely go with that. But we will revisit it, I think, with you in time, if you're happy to do that, which you are. So that's good. But in the meantime, thank you for sharing your story and being so candid and open about it, because some of the stuff that you brought up is kind of stuff that goes on, and I mean, obviously adoption is complex, and even to the point where assessments and stage 1, stage 2, matching, all that sort of stuff, it's all got its own kind of unique thing. And if you don't, I guess if you don't get the right person working with you, then it can sometimes not be quite right. So
well, I'd like to say, I mean, I said it at the top before we started recording, if this can help anybody, then I've done something good, right? Like, the conversations helped me in my journey. So this is me trying to give back a little bit to the thing that helped me, And I'd just like to make clear to anybody who's gotten this far on the podcast that not at any point was James asked to promote or do anything positive about the podcast. He's just a podcast listener who offered to come on. So my PayPal is it's true. If you're giving anybody's, give mine. Okay, it's true, but you were one of my main sources for a lot of adoption information, and it has proved very helpful. So good. Well, I don't want to say I'm giving back because it's your thing, but it feels a little bit like it's a full circle for me now. Good. Sharing a story that got me to where I am.
Cool. Well, listen, thank you again. And I will talk to you in a year, 2 years, maybe 3, who knows, but we'll talk to you then. But thank you in the meantime.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Really kind.